Oh boy.
When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
You're watching Adventures in Music Theory with your host, Dr. Robbins.
Hello, welcome to the April 3rd edition of Online Form and Analysis. This is probably going to be a rather short video today, in part because one of the concepts we're going to go over in it is a little bit tricky, and you might find yourself wanting to go back and review that portion. But we're going to talk a little bit today about how sonata form can be modified and refined a little bit further, and composers can make it, well, more complicated sometimes. What we've looked at up till now have been the most normal arrangements of sonata form. The exposition, development, recapitulation with primary, secondary, closing themes being presented and then recapitulated, and tonal schemes that come from binary form. Tonic to dominant and then back to tonic for the recapitulation if it's in a major key, tonic to relative major or dominant minor, and then back to tonic for the recapitulation if it's in a minor key. But what we're going to look at today is things that can make sonata form expand beyond those confines and stuff, because as I told you all when I first presented this, sonata form is a very widely used form from the classical era on through the 19th century. And part of why it's so widely used is because it can be so widely adapted and modified. And we're going to look at some composers going in and doing that today. What's on the slide now is the basic sonata form of exposition, development, and recapitulation. And then you'll notice off to the sides there, I've put in the words introduction and coda in italics. Those are two optional parts that can be added to a sonata form. A sonata form might have an introduction tacked on to the beginning, or it might have a coda tacked on after the recapitulation. And what an introduction does is an introduction, obviously it comes before the exposition, it introduces it. Introductions are slow and they tend to be very dramatic. They tend to really create suspense and create this sense of anticipation and waiting for the arrival of the exposition, which will often be allegro and which will sort of, resolve the tension that was created by this very, very turbulent introduction. Codas happen after the recapitulation. In fact, the definition of a coda is musical material that goes beyond what happened in the exposition. So when a recapitulation is doing its job, it's repeating or recapitulating the things we heard in the exposition, the primary theme, the closing theme, the secondary theme between those two, of course, and then the codetta at the end, if there was a codetta in the exposition. If the music keeps on going after all that's happened, that's a coda. And sometimes the music can go on for quite a long time after everything's been recapitulated. If that happens, then the coda can become so long that it can be like a second development section. And I'm going to have you all look at a piece of music that does that for the homework. What's displaying on the screen right now is the first two pages of the Beethoven Pathetique Sonata in C minor. And the whole first page you're seeing there is the introduction. The second page is the beginning of the exposition. But the introduction for this is this is a good example of what an introduction looks and sounds like. If you'll notice the exposition on the second page, it's allegro, it's very up-tempo. But the introduction that comes before it on the first page is marked at a very slow tempo. It's marked grave. And if you look at how Beethoven builds it, you'll see he's building a very dramatic type of music. He's got those kind of crashy chords at the beginning. Boom, ba-boom, ba-boom, boom. Stuff that really sort of, says, drama, says anticipation and excitement. And a lot of the melodic lines in that introduction tend to be very show-offy, very rhapsodic and virtuosic, lots of chromatic scales, things like that. I'm going to leave it to you all to go listen to this on your own time and get a feel for how that introduction sort of paves the way for the exposition. As per codas, one of the pieces I'm going to have you do before the next video is the Beethoven Waldstein Sonata. So I want you to look at the Waldstein Sonata as an example of one of those very, very long codas that becomes like a second development section. So we can see a composer can mess with the beginning of a sonata form by tacking on an introduction, and he or she might mess with the end of it by putting on a coda. They can even mess with the middle of it, with the development section. The easiest way to mess with the development section is don't have one, which is what we call sonatina form. It's a sonata form that has no development section. It has an exposition with the primary, secondary, and closing themes and the appropriate tonal relationships. And then it recapitulates the primary, secondary, and closing themes with appropriate tonal relationships. But there's no development section between them, or virtually no development section between them. This is the Beethoven example that's in your textbook. And it shows the ending of Beethoven's exposition. You'll see this starts pretty late in the piece. It starts around measure 40. But I've got the codetta labeled up there at the end of that first system. And then in the second system, you can see the beginning of the recapitulation is labeled 4 measures later. The codetta ends at the beginning of the second system in measure 44. The recapitulation begins in measure 46. The whole development section of this piece, if you can call it that, is that one circled fortissimo chord that's on the score. This is basically a sonata without a development section, which, as I say, some people call sonatina form. Okay, now I want to talk about atypical tonal plans, and I want to do it by listening to a sonata form without the score. And it's a form that's got very typical thematic plans, and it's easy to hear them. So I'm going to play this movement. What I want you all to do is simply this. When you hear the recapitulation begin, raise your hand out there in Cyberland. This is a sonata by Mozart. It's one that might sound familiar to you. It's in the key of C major. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the second time through the exposition, and then I'll play through the development section and into the recapitulation. And as I say, your job is raise your hand when you hear the recapitulation. So here we go. Second time through the exposition. It's going to begin with the primary theme in C major. Here we go. Here's the transition now. And we're moving to G major. And when we get there, we'll have the secondary theme. Secondary theme. Here's a closing. Codetta. Here's the development. Starts off in a minor key. Remember, your job is to listen for the beginning of the recapitulation. Raise your hand when you hear it. And I hope you just now raised your hand because this is the recapitulation of the primary theme. And here's our transition again, leading us to the secondary theme. Here's the secondary theme. And that's really all I need us to hear to talk about what I want to talk about. Hopefully you were able to recognize the recapitulation fairly easily. It jumps out because that theme is very recognizable. Here's the thing though, I told you all this was a sonata movement in C major, and it is, but when Mozart began that recapitulation, he didn't begin it in the key of C. I've got the score displayed on the board there, and the top system is the beginning of the exposition, which shows the primary theme being stated in C major. You can see that it's very obviously in C major. The first three notes form a C major triad. The second system shows the beginning of the recapitulation, which Mozart is beginning in the key of F major. And the first three notes of the theme are an F major triad, and there are B flats in it. And Mozart's beginning his recapitulation not in the tonic key of C, but in the subdominant key of F. And this is what can be termed a subdominant recapitulation. And there's a reason why it makes sense. Here's why the subdominant recapitulation works. Think about what happens in the exposition. We state the primary theme in the tonic key, C. Then we go to the secondary theme by modulating to the dominant key of C, G. We go down a fourth. In the recapitulation, when Mozart begins by stating the primary theme in the subdominant key in F, then if he goes to F's dominant for the secondary theme, think about what key is F's dominant. It's C. So he's going to actually manage to end up the movement in the right key, because just like he moved from tonic C to dominant of C, G in the exposition, if he begins the recapitulation in F, then if he modulates for the secondary theme to F's dominant, he's going to end in the key of C, which is the key that he needs to end the movement in. And here's Schubert making things even more complicated. This is a Schubert piano sonata in the key of B flat major. It's a very long movement. We're not going to be able to listen to it here. But if you look at what's going on, it starts out the way you'd think a sonata form in B flat might start. The first thing we hear is the primary theme in the B flat major key, which is the tonic of the movement. I've got up through the beginning of the transition, and it's a long transition because Schubert doesn't get to the secondary theme until measure 40 something, like measure 47 or 48, I believe. So when Schubert gets to the secondary theme, he doesn't state it in the dominant key of F major. Instead, he states that secondary theme in the key of F sharp minor. It's a really weird, distantly related key to the key of B flat major. And it's certainly not the key we'd expect to find our secondary theme showing up in. That's not how binary form works. It goes from tonic to dominant, not from B flat major to F sharp minor. Schubert does present the closing theme in the exposition in the key of F major, which is the dominant key and the key we'd expect. And the way Schubert makes it work out is simply this. He was in F sharp minor for the secondary theme, and he just moves down a half step to F major for the closing theme. But this is going to have ramifications for how Schubert composes the recapitulation of this work. When Schubert recapitulates, he doesn't do everything in the tonic key. Instead, that secondary theme shows up not in B flat major, but in B minor, and you can see it up there on the score excerpt that's on the slide now. And B minor's a really weird, distantly related key to B flat major as well. But it makes sense because when Schubert needs to state the closing theme, he just moves down a half step from B minor to B flat major, and he ends in the key that the movement is supposed to end in. This is what your textbook refers to as recapitulatory distance, which is not a term anybody else uses, but I use it and I think it's neat. And what it basically means is this. It means that sometimes if you're in the wrong key in your exposition, you need to recapitulate in the right wrong key in the recapitulation. And that's what's happening here. And the box at the bottom of the page is showing that. Schubert's secondary theme was in F sharp minor, and that's the wrong key to be in. But since in recapitulations we often hear themes recapitulated a fifth lower than they were in the exposition, when Schubert recapitulates that wrong theme in F sharp minor, he recapitulates it a fifth lower in B minor, which is the right wrong key to be in. And then if you look how he gets out of everything, it's the same solution. In the exposition, he moves from F sharp minor down to the dominant key of F major, which is where he's supposed to be. In the recapitulation, when the secondary theme's in B minor, he moves down a half step to the tonic key of B flat major, which is the key he's supposed to be ending the movement in. Recapitulatory distance. It's a neat thing. But it's a little bit of a tricky concept. And this slide here isn't anything particularly tricky no matter what. In fact, this is just a page from the book I'm sharing to call it to your attention for if there's ever a test to study for, hint, 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 hint. Because what it does is it shows you the most normal way a sonata form in a major key or a sonata form in a minor key might be structured. So you might want to pay a special attention to those things because they're certainly there to help you. Enjoy. All right, and now let's end with a concept that's decidedly not overly difficult, and it's not really about sonata form specifically, but it's about that word sonata, because we find it a lot on programs and in titles of pieces. There are a lot of pieces with titles like Sonata in D minor for bassoon and organ, or Sonata in A major for heckelhorn and boys choir, or whatever. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's in sonata form or only in sonata form. A lot of times when they say sonata in such and such for such and such, what composers are doing is they're going back to the oldest definition of sonata, which is, from the Renaissance and Baroque eras, when composers talked about music that was played or sounded, sonata in Italian, versus music that was sung or chanted, cantata in Italian. So, sonata simply meant played, cantata meant sung. They've come to mean bigger things as time goes on. So a lot of times when we see sonata for trumpet and harpsichord, that's telling us that's a piece to be played. But a lot of times you can count on certain things happening in those works. So a lot of times when we're talking about something being entitled sonata, there's a certain way that not just a particular movement might go, but that all the movements might go. And they fall into what's often called a sonata cycle or a multi-movement form. Multi-movement forms are usually 3 or 4 movement works. And composers have ways over time that they've come to like to do that. Let's look at what a 3-movement sonata cycle might be like. So down there in the box, you see I've got the 3 movements laid out. And a lot of times when composers started writing 3-movement sonata cycles from the classic era on, they would tend to put their first movement in sonata form, which, by the way, is why a lot of people do call it first movement form. The typical way a first movement happens is it tends to be in sonata form, although sometimes it might be in theme and variation form, which we'll talk about later. And the sonata form is in the tonic key. So if the piece is called Sonata in B-flat major, what that means is the first movement's going to be in the key of B-flat major. But the composer is not going to necessarily write every key or every movement in B-flat major. So let's look at the second movement. A lot of times the second movement in a 3-movement sonata cycle is the slow movement of the 3. Composers like to write those in ternary form sometimes, or theme and variations, or rondo, which are things we'll be talking about in the coming lessons, or sonatina form, meaning that sonata without development form, or even good old sonata form again. And key-wise, they tend to do something a little bit differently. If you think about, a lot of times if it's in a major key, they'll be in the subdominant key for their second movement. So if they're in B-flat major, then they'll do the second movement in E-flat major. But there's an easier way to think about it than this. What they tend to do is, if you think about your keys on the circle of fifths, you know how C major is at 12 o'clock, G major is at 1 o'clock, C major is at 12 o'clock, F major is at 11 o'clock. What composers like to do is for the second movement, they like to set the clock back an hour. So if you're in the key of B-flat major, 2 flats, then for your second movement, you might want to set the clock back 1 hour from 10 o'clock to 9 o'clock to the key of 3 flats, E-flat major. So a lot of times for the second movement, the composer is going to add a flat to the key signature or subtract a sharp from the key signature. And sometimes in minor keys, what that'll mean is, if our first movement was in the key of, like, say, D minor with 1 flat, then the composer might put the second movement in the key of 2 flats, and he might do that in G minor, or he or she might decide instead to do that in the key of B-flat major. And then third movements in a 3-movement sonata cycle tend to favor rondo form or sonata rondo form or theme and variations form, all of which is what we're getting to in the next lessons. Or again, sonata form could be a contender. And certainly they're going to want to probably end the sonata cycle in the tonic key. And here's what a 4-movement sonata cycle might look like. Basically, what happens in a 4-movement sonata cycle is there's a third movement that's inserted that's between the second and fourth movements. And in the oldest sonata forms from the classical era, that third movement is often a minuet and a trio. When composers start wanting a really, really fast movement, a lot of times they'll put in a super fast minuet, and they'll call it a scherzo in a trio, but that tends to be reserved for the third spot in a 4-movement sonata cycle. And the favored form for that is to put it in composite ternary form. And of course, since it's a minuet and trio or a scherzo and trio, it's easy to see how composite ternary form works well for that, because you could write your minuet as a ternary form perhaps, and then you could write your trio as a binary form or a rounded binary form. And then when you put them together and go minuet, trio, minuet, you get the composite ternary design of that. Favored key is often the tonic, but as the Romantic era goes on, composers start exploring other things. But this is how multi-movement form or sonata cycle works, and it's something that is worth knowing. And this brings us to the end of today's lesson. As I said, there were some complicated topics in there, namely the idea of recapitulatory distance. So make sure you read up on that in Unit 24 and email me with any questions or chat me with any questions if you have them. For the next episode out, we're going to analyze a couple of sonata form movements that are a little bit trickier than the Beethoven F minor or the Mozart B flat major that we looked at. So in advance, what I want you to do is this. Make sure you've read all of Unit 24 about sonata form. And of course, you can also find recordings of all the pieces in there online if you'd like to listen to them as well. Then I want you to look in the Unit 24 homework at assignments 24.4 and 24.5. One of them is the Beethoven Waldstein Sonata, the first movement, which has a big coda that I want you to take note of. And I also want you to look at how Beethoven presents his themes in the exposition, and then how he recapitulates them. So pay attention to that, especially tonal relationships. The other movement I want you to look at is the Ravel sonatine. And don't be confused by the fact that Ravel's calling it sonatine. It doesn't have anything to do with sonata or with sonatina form. It is in sonata form. But I want you to look at how Ravel handles sonata form in that movement. This is not something to turn in. I'm not going to grade it. But I want you to look at it before the next video on April 6th, because those two movements are what we're going to go over. So study them, analyze them, bring your thoughts to the video session, and then you can look at seeing how your analysis squares up with the analysis I'm going to present. So until then, I will see you next time. Get rest, eat well, stay sane, wash your hands, and I look forward to our next meeting. Take care.